The cannon that destroyed Constantinople was never supposed to exist. The man who forged it had first come to the Byzantine emperor. Constantine XI couldn't afford the price. So the engineer crossed the Bosphorus, offered his services to the Sultan instead, and was paid 4 times as much. The very weapon that would unmake a civilization had been refused by the people it would kill. This is not a story about emperors. It is not a story about sultans or cannons or the tides of history. It is the story of the people who were still inside when the doors closed. The ones who packed what they could carry, who locked their houses and went to Hagia Sophia to pray, believing an angel would descend from the dome and drive any invader back, who stood on the harbour walls in the dark watching the Venetian ships thinking, if it comes to the worst, we'll get on one of those, who told their children to stay quiet and stay together, who waited and finally understood that no one was coming. On the morning of May 29th, 1453, as the Ottoman army broke through the Theodosian walls and poured into the streets, there were 7 fully rigged ships anchored in the Golden Horn harbour. 7 ships that could have taken thousands. The harbour chains had been cut. The sailors were at their oars. The exits were open, and almost no one reached them. This is the story of why. The last candle was lit in the Fanar quarter sometime near midnight. Her name was Euphrosyne. She was perhaps 50 years old, though hardship had written older lines into her face. Her husband, a cloth merchant who had traded at the Genoese market at Galata, had died of the fever 2 winters past. Her son Demetrios was 19. 3 nights before, she had sewn his name into the lining of his coat, in the old Greek way, the way her own mother had taught her, so that if he fell on the walls, someone would know to tell her. He had laughed at her for that. He had laughed because he was 19, and because he did not yet believe that a wall his city had defended for 1,000 years could actually fall. She had not laughed. Euphrosyne had been baking since before dawn, as she had every day for 30 years. The clay oven in the back room, the smell of charcoal and olive oil, the familiar rhythm of folding and pressing. But tonight, the bread she made was not for selling. She was loading it into baskets. Flat loaves, hard-baked, the kind that stayed good for days. She planned to carry them up to the wall defenders at the Blachernay section, the northern stretch, where the old palace met the newer ramparts, and the Ottoman guns had been hammering for weeks. Outside her window, the city moved like it was dreaming. All across Constantinople that night, people were carrying things. Icons and relics, coins sewn into belts, silver crosses and folded documents, handfuls of earth from family graves. In the great churches, priests were celebrating what they didn't know would be the last liturgy ever performed in a free Christian Constantinople. And for the first and only time in living memory, Greek Orthodox clergy and Latin Catholic clergy were praying together, side by side, their centuries of theological war dissolved for a single night into the same desperate prayer. In the harbour, the Venetian ships sat at anchor. Their hulls were dark against the water. A few sailors moved on the decks, watching the fires on the distant hilltops where the Ottoman camp stretched to the horizon. And in the church of Hagia Sophia, the great church, the mother of all churches, the golden mosaics threw their light across a congregation of the frightened and the faithful. And Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of the Romans, knelt on the marble floor and wept. By morning, it would all be over. By morning, Euphrosyne would be searching the streets for her son and finding instead the first Ottoman soldiers moving in disciplined columns through the alleyways of the Fanar. By morning, the last ferry would be gone. The city that was about to die had once been the largest in Europe. At its peak in the 5th century, Constantinople was home to perhaps 500,000 people, a metropolis of such scale that when the rest of the Western world had collapsed into subsistence villages and abandoned roads, this city still had running aqueducts, a public theatre, an organized postal system, libraries, hospitals, a university. When Rome fell to audacious barbarians in 476, Constantinople did not fall. It simply continued. 1,000 years is a long time to be the centre of the world, and in that 1,000 years Constantinople had been besieged before. The Persians came in 626 and were repelled. The Arab armies came in 674 and again in 717 and could not take the walls. The Bulgars, the Rus, the Pechenegs, all came, all failed. The city had a weapon called Greek fire, a petroleum-based incendiary that burned on water and could not be extinguished by drowning it, and the walls, and the chain across the Golden Horn, and the geography itself, a peninsula that could only be approached by land through the narrowest of fronts. There had been one exception. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade, ostensibly headed to the Holy Land to fight Muslims, had instead turned and sacked Constantinople. The city was taken not by an enemy from outside Christendom, but by fellow Christians. The Crusaders held it for 57 years. The Byzantine emperors ruled in exile. In 1261, the empire was reconstituted, but not fully. What came back was a rump state. That was the wound that never healed. The 1204 sack had broken something that the Persians and the Arabs and the Bulgars had not been able to break. The population never recovered to its former scale. The treasury never recovered. The trust between the Byzantine Church and Western Christianity, already strained, was shattered. When Mehmed II arrived at the walls in 1453, he was completing a process that began in 1204 with men who wore the cross. In this diminished city, on this May evening in 1453, Euphrosyne lit her oven. She did this because she was a baker, and this is what bakers do. The bread did not know that the empire was dying. The yeast did not know. The fire in the oven did not know. Only the woman tending it knew, and she had made her choice, that the bread would be baked, that the morning would have something in it worth eating, that ordinary life would be honoured, even here, even now, even on the last night. This is the most human thing in the entire history of the fall of Constantinople. Not the heroism of the emperor who refused to leave his walls, not the ingenuity of the engineer who built the cannon, not the strategic genius of the Sultan who moved 70 ships over a hill. The most human thing was a woman who decided that the bread would still be made. Because someone would need it tomorrow. Because this is what you do. Because stopping would mean that the catastrophe had already won. Who was she? Who were the people like her? The thousands who did not escape, who were not in the history books, who existed in this city with their own dailiness and their own irreplaceable lives. To understand what was lost on May 29, 1453, we have to go back further. We have to understand what Constantinople actually was. Not the icon, not the symbol, but the place, the inhabited human place. To understand what was lost when Constantinople fell, you first have to understand what it had already lost. Because by 1453, the city the Ottomans were besieging was not the Constantinople of legend. It was not the golden metropolis that had ruled the Mediterranean world, that had held 1 million people within its walls, that had been the beating heart of 2 civilizations at once. Roman law and Greek philosophy wrapped inside Christian faith. That city had been dying for 2 centuries. The Constantinople of 1453 held perhaps 50,000 people, some historians say fewer. Within walls that had been built to contain 400,000 souls, there were vast stretches of open land, abandoned houses collapsing into gardens, churches falling into disuse, whole neighborhoods that had simply emptied over the generations. A traveler approaching the city from the land walls could walk for minutes through what appeared to be countryside, pastures, orchards, the occasional goat, and then suddenly come upon a cluster of inhabited houses, as if encountering an island in an empty sea. This was what centuries of catastrophe looked like on the ground. The Fourth Crusade had dealt the first mortal blow. In 1204, the Knights of the Fourth Crusade, Catholic crusaders who were supposedly heading to Jerusalem to fight Muslims, had instead turned and sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. They had looted Hagia Sophia. They had melted down the bronze statues on the Hippodrome. They had stolen the relics and the gold and the sacred objects accumulated over 1,000 years and shipped them back to Venice. The bronze horses now above the facade of San Marco Cathedral in Venice were taken from Constantinople's Hippodrome. The spiritual heart of the Eastern world was carved up among Latin lords for 60 years. When the Greeks finally retook their city in 1261, they found a gutted shell. The Venetians had stripped it so thoroughly that there was barely a palace left intact. Then came the Black Death, arriving in Constantinople in 1347, killing perhaps a third of those who had survived the Crusader years. Then came wave after wave of Ottoman encroachment, the Byzantines losing Anatolia, then Macedonia, then Thessaloniki, until by the 15th century they held little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories in Greece. The empire had become the city. The city had become a memory of an empire. Yet within that memory, something extraordinary persisted. The people of Constantinople in 1453 still called themselves Romans, not Greeks, Romans, the Romaioi, heirs of the unbroken governmental tradition that stretched back to Augustus Caesar, however attenuated and diminished that inheritance had become. Their emperor still bore the title Emperor of the Romans. Their church still claimed the theological authority of the first Christian councils. This identity was not merely ceremonial. It was the bedrock of how these people understood their place in the world. And so, when the Ottoman cannons began their bombardment in early April of 1453, the people of Constantinople did not experience it purely as a military threat. They experienced it as an existential assault on everything they believed themselves to be. But before we get to the cannons and the walls, we need to sit for a moment in what Constantinople actually felt like to live in during those final years. The Fanar Quarter, where Euphrosyne kept her bakery and her clay oven, was one of the city's most populated neighborhoods, huddled along the shore of the Golden Horn. The name came from the lighthouse that stood nearby, and the neighborhood had always been associated with the sea. Sailors and fishermen, merchants who traded with the Genoese colony at Galata just across the water, chandlers and rope makers, and the families of harbour workers. It was also where many of the city's Greek intellectual and ecclesiastical elite had settled, close to the Patriarchate, close to the water, close to the possibility of escape if escape became necessary. That proximity to the harbour was not coincidental. By 1453, many of Constantinople's Greek elite had already made their peace with the idea of leaving. The question was not if, but when. Some had already gone. The great intellectual migration had been underway for decades. Scholars carrying manuscripts had been arriving in Italian cities, Florence, Venice, Rome, since the early 15th century, bringing Greek texts that Western Europe had not seen since the fall of Rome. Cardinal Bessarion, one of the finest Greek minds of the age, had been living in Italy for years. Gemistos Plethon, who had electrified Florentine philosophers with his lectures on Plato, had departed. The drain was visible and constant. Those who remained did so for reasons that varied: attachment to property, family ties, religious conviction, sheer inertia, or the very human refusal to believe that what everyone said was inevitable would actually happen. And some remained because they had nowhere else to go. For every scholar with connections in Venice, there were 10 ordinary people: the baker and the fisherman and the sailor's wife and the monk in the small parish church, who had no Italian contacts, no Latin, no portable profession, who were tied to the city by the 1,000 invisible threads of ordinary life. These were the people who would still be in Constantinople when the gates closed. They had spent their lives in a city slowly dying, but nothing, not the empty neighborhoods or the silent palaces or the distant sound of Ottoman drums, had prepared them for what the next 56 days would bring. The Fanar was not a wealthy neighborhood. It was not the neighborhood of the aristocracy, or the high clergy, or the imperial court. It was a working neighborhood: artisans, small merchants, craftspeople, the people who made and sold the things that kept the city functioning. Bakers and butchers and tanners and potters and the men who managed the small boats that moved goods across the Golden Horn to the markets on the other side. The people of the Fanar, like all Byzantine Constantinopolitans, thought of themselves as Romaioi. Not Greeks. That word, to them, had connotations of the pagan past, of the pre-Christian classical world that the empire had superseded. They were Romans, the heirs of Augustus and Constantine and Justinian, the continuing civilization. This was not delusion. It was historical continuity. The institutions of the Byzantine Empire were the direct descendants of Roman institutions. Roman law, the Codex Justinianus, the great 6th century compilation of Roman legal tradition, governed their civil disputes. The emperor held his office through a chain of succession that could be traced, however imperfectly, back to the first emperors. The church that baptized their children and buried their dead had been the Church of the Roman Empire since Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 CE. They spoke Greek because the Eastern Mediterranean had always spoken Greek. Alexander the Great had spread Greek as the administrative language of the Hellenistic world, and it had remained the language of commerce and culture, and eventually church liturgy across the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. The shift from Latin to Greek had been organic, pragmatic, centuries long. It did not make the Byzantines less Roman. It made them Romans who spoke Greek. But by 1453, the world did not particularly care about this distinction. The Ottoman Turks and the Venetian merchants and the Genoese traders and the Western Crusaders who passed through, all of them called the Byzantines Greeks, or simply Christians. The identity that the Byzantines maintained with such careful precision looked, from outside, like the self-classification of a diminished people clinging to a prestige that had passed. The demographic collapse of Constantinople was not simply a matter of poverty or plague, though both played roles. It was a collapse of confidence. From the 1300s onward, as the Ottoman Empire consolidated its control over the territories surrounding the city, Constantinople was increasingly an island of Byzantine rule in an Ottoman sea. The nobility, who had estates in the surrounding countryside, lost them. The trade networks that had fed the city's wealth were diverted. The sense that the city had a future, that it was worth investing in, worth raising children in, eroded. People left, not in panic, but in the gradual, practical way that people leave places when the economic calculus shifts. Merchants moved their operations to Venice or Genoa. Scholars took positions at Italian courts. The younger sons of noble families found that the opportunities elsewhere were better than those available at home. It was not flight. It was the accumulation of individually reasonable decisions that together produced a city slowly emptying of its own momentum. The ones who stayed, the Euphrosins of the Fanar, stayed because this was their place. Their bakery, their neighborhood, their network of obligations and relationships and shared memories. The things that root ordinary people in ordinary places are not grand ideological commitments. They are the specifics of a particular life in a particular location. The neighbor who owes you a favor. The well in the courtyard that your grandfather dug. The church where your mother is buried. These are not things that transfer easily to Venice. Chapter 2. The Canon and the King. His name was Urban. Some sources call him Hungarian. Others say Transylvanian. He appears in the historical record suddenly, in late 1452, as a master cannon founder with an extraordinary gift, the ability to cast bronze and iron guns larger than anyone had ever made before. He came first to Constantinople. Constantine XI Palaiologos received him in the Blakeney Palace, where the imperial apartments had been open to the sky in places for 30 years. Their roofs patched with whatever timber could be found. The emperor was a serious man, a soldier's man. He had governed frontier territories before inheriting the throne, and he understood military necessity in a way some of his predecessors had not. He wanted Urban's cannon. He simply could not pay for it. The imperial treasury was so depleted that Constantine had recently been reduced to melting down church plate to pay his soldiers. He offered Urban a fraction of his asking price. Urban thanked him courteously and crossed the Bosphorus. Mehmed II paid him 4 times what he had asked of Constantine. He gave Urban access to the finest ironworks in the Ottoman Empire, unlimited raw materials, and a workforce of hundreds. Within 3 months, Urban had produced a gun so large that it required 60 oxen to pull and took 2 hours to reload between shots. It fired stone balls weighing 600 pounds. The stones it threw could shatter the Theodosian walls, the walls that had held for 1,000 years. This is one of history's bleakest ironies. The very technology that ended Byzantium was technology that Byzantium had rejected because it was too poor to afford it. Mehmed II had besieged Constantinople before. His father Murad II had attempted it in 1422 and failed. But the younger Mehmed who became Sultan at the age of 19, had made the conquest of Constantinople the central obsession of his reign. He had studied the city's defences obsessively. He had read everything available about previous sieges. He understood the Theodosian walls better than many of the people who lived behind them. He also understood what Constantinople represented. It was not merely a strategic position, though it was certainly that a city sitting at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, commanding the Bosphorus Strait. It was the symbolic capital of the Christian Roman Empire. Taking it would make Mehmed not just a great general, but a historical figure of the first magnitude. He would be the one who did what no Muslim ruler had ever managed to do. He was 21 years old. The siege began on April 2nd, 1453. Urban's great cannon fired its first shot at the Theodosian walls on April 6th. The sound was heard 40 miles away. Inside the city, the ground shook. People ran out of their houses into the streets. Euphrosyne would later recall, in the weeks after, in the altered city that would no longer allow such conversations openly, that she had been kneading bread when the first shot landed, and the force of it had knocked her clay water jar from its shelf. But the Theodosian walls did not immediately fall. This is the part that often gets overlooked in the triumphalist narrative of Ottoman conquest. The walls were extraordinary. Built in the early 5th century under Theodosius II, they consisted of 3 parallel lines of defence: an outer wall, a higher main wall, and behind it the massive inner wall, some of whose towers still stand today. In between, a dry moat and fighting platforms. The whole system was 60 feet deep and defended at intervals by 96 towers. For 1,000 years, no one had breached them. The defenders developed a system. Every night, after the Ottoman cannon had fallen silent, repair crews, civilian volunteers, not soldiers, went out with timber, sandbags, rubble, and whatever else they could find, and plugged the holes. Every morning, the cannon fired again. Every evening, the damage was partially repaired. It was exhausting, demoralizing, and ultimately insufficient. Because the fundamental problem was numbers. Constantine XI had, at maximum, 7,000 defenders for 14 miles of walls. Mehmed had somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 soldiers. The exact number is disputed, but the disparity is not. Even if the walls could be held, the men on them could not be everywhere at once. Every night, the defenders grew more tired. Every morning, they faced the same problem with fewer resources, and no help was coming. This is the part that the people of Constantinople found hardest to accept. They had appealed to Rome, to Venice, to Genoa, to Hungary, to the kingdoms of Western Europe. Pope Nicholas V had called for a crusade. It had produced almost nothing. The reasons were complex. Ongoing wars between Italian city-states, conflict in the Balkans, the exhaustion and fragmentation of Western Christendom after decades of internal strife. But the result was simple. Venice sent 2 galleys, not the fleet Constantinople had begged for, just 2 galleys. Genoa sent a private citizen, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, with 700 soldiers at his own expense. He would prove to be the most important military figure of the entire siege, but 700 men against 50,000. The people of Constantinople watched the horizon every day for sails, for the fleet that was supposed to come, for the West that was supposed to care. The horizon stayed empty. But there was one thing the defenders had that Mehmed did not expect. Not numbers, not weapons, not outside help. Something stranger and older than any of those. And on the night before the final assault, it would be carried through the streets of a doomed city in the dark, while the world held its breath. What Mehmed understood, and what no previous besieging army had understood, was a simple technical fact. The walls of Constantinople could not be taken from the front. The Theodosian land walls, built in the 5th century, repaired and reinforced for 1,000 years, were not merely thick. They were a system. The outer wall, the inner wall, the tower sequence, the moat. They created a defense in depth that required attackers to take each element sequentially, under fire, while the defenders were always higher and better sheltered than the attackers. No army had managed it. The solution was the cannon. not a cannon as previous armies had used them, relatively small mobile weapons for field engagements or battering gate doors. Mehmed wanted something different. He wanted a weapon capable of projecting a stone ball of such mass and velocity that it would crack the ashlar facing off the Byzantine walls, and then crack the rubble core beneath, and then, over time, reduce the entire structure to rubble. The mathematics of this were known. What was not known was whether anyone could actually build and operate such a weapon. The largest cannons in use in Europe at the time fired stone balls of perhaps 100 pounds. The walls of Constantinople required something substantially more than that. Urban of Hungary, sometimes called Urban of Transylvania, the precise origin is disputed, had been working on large-format artillery for some years. He was a specialist in a new and specialized field, the casting of very large bronze barrels, capable of withstanding the enormous internal pressures of firing very large projectiles. He had come to Constantinople first. Constantine XI had received him, had been interested in what he proposed, and had ultimately been unable to pay. The sums involved were not trivial. Urban's cannon required enormous quantities of bronze, thousands of pounds of it. It required a specialized foundry operation that took months. It required a team of skilled craftsmen who had to be paid and housed and fed. It required, after construction, a transport operation of enormous complexity. The barrel alone weighed over 15 tons and had to be moved from its casting site near Adrianople to the walls of Constantinople over rough terrain. Constantinople's imperial treasury in 1452 simply did not have the money. Mehmed paid Urban 4 times what he had asked from Constantine. The cannon was built, and then it was tested outside Adrianople before an audience that included the Sultan himself. The test firing was heard 6 miles away. The stone ball, weighing somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 pounds, depending on which source you believe, travelled over a mile and buried itself 4 feet into the ground where it landed. Villages within earshot sent delegations to find out what had happened. Mehmed is said to have wept when he saw the result. Whether this is true or embellished by later chroniclers, it captures something real. The test firing of Urban's cannon was the moment the fall of Constantinople became a practical rather than a theoretical proposition. Before the cannon, taking the walls was merely very difficult. After the cannon, it was a matter of time and ammunition. Constantine XI, watching his city from its walls, must have known this too. The Ottoman campfires were visible on the plain outside. The reports of the cannon test had certainly reached him. He was defending a city with 7,000 fighters against an army of perhaps 50,000 or more, and the enemy had a weapon that the walls had not been designed to withstand. The question was not whether the walls could be taken. The question was whether help would come in time. It would not come. Let's talk about who was actually standing on those walls. Because it was not the Byzantine army. By 1453, there was no Byzantine army in any meaningful sense. Constantine V there could muster perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 Greek soldiers, men with varying levels of training, inadequate pay, and the inescapable psychological weight of defending a cause that most of Europe had already written off. The rest of the defence was assembled from fragments. There were Venetians, sailors and merchants and soldiers who had been caught in the city when the siege began, and who had chosen to fight rather than surrender their ships. There were Genoese, private soldiers and adventurers, including Giustiniani's company. There were Catalans, a few surviving Aragonese crusaders, some Cretan archers. There were Greek monks who had put down their liturgical books and picked up spears. There were old men who had not held a weapon in 20 years. There were also, movingly, several ships' crews who had come from outside, a small Venetian relief force that had arrived in January 1453 and decided to stay. The man who held this improvised force together was not Constantine V, though the emperor fought magnificently. It was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. Giustiniani was Genoese, from one of the great merchant families, but he was also a professional soldier of the First Order, a man who had spent his life studying fortification and siege warfare. He arrived in late January 1453 with 700 soldiers, well equipped and well trained, and Constantine immediately gave him the critical command. The Mesoteikion, the middle section of the Theodosian walls, the section that Urban's cannon was hammering most heavily. For 54 days, Giustiniani held the most attacked section of the most threatened wall in the world. This is not a small thing. The daily pattern was genuinely brutal. The Ottoman cannon fired continuously from dawn until dusk. Urban's Great Bombard, the largest gun, needed 2 hours between shots, but the Ottomans had dozens of smaller cannon that fired constantly. The Theodosian walls, which had been built before the age of gunpowder and were not designed to absorb cannon fire, cracked and crumbled throughout the day. Every evening, Giustiniani organized repair parties. Every morning, they faced the same destruction. He also had to manage the constant tension between his various nationalities of defenders. Venetians and Genoese had spent the last 100 years in commercial rivalry that had occasionally turned violent. On the walls of Constantinople, they were supposed to be on the same side and mostly managed it, but not without friction that had to be managed, suppressed, redirected into something useful. The Venetian community in Constantinople deserves particular attention because their situation was uniquely complicated. Venice and Constantinople had a relationship that went back centuries, commercial, cultural, political, often antagonistic. It was Venetian ships that had redirected the Fourth Crusade to sack Constantinople in 1204. The Byzantine emperors had never entirely forgotten this. Relations had improved over the decades, but the Venetian colony in Constantinople, several thousand merchants, factors and their families, occupied an uncomfortable middle position. They were loyal enough to fight. But Venice, the city-state, far away, was playing a careful diplomatic game. When the Ottoman siege began, Venice's official position was one of nominal neutrality. They didn't want to provoke Mehmed into attacking their commercial interests across the Aegean. The 2 galleys they sent were a gesture, not a commitment. The Venetians who chose to stay and fight did so against the advice of their own government, at their own initiative. And then there was the Genoese colony at Galata. Galata was the trading colony directly across the Golden Horn from Constantinople, technically outside the Byzantine city, on the northern shore of the harbour. It was Genoese territory, prosperous, commercially vital, home to several thousand Genoese merchants and citizens. And in 1453, the Podestar of Galata, the Genoese governor, made the extraordinary decision to remain officially neutral. Officially neutral. While their Greek neighbours were being besieged and dying on the walls. The Podestar's reasoning was commercial and survival-oriented. If Constantinople fell, and he privately believed it would, the Genoese colony needed to have clean hands to negotiate favourable treatment from Mehmed. So Galata maintained trade with the Ottoman camp. Galata's port remained open. Genoese merchants continued doing business. It was a pragmatic calculation that saved the Genoese colony. It was also, from a moral standpoint, one of the more troubling decisions of the siege. Some individual Genoese, like Giustiniani himself, defied this official neutrality and fought for Constantinople. But Galata as a whole watched from across the water, and ordinary Greeks in the Phanar neighbourhood could look across the harbour on any given day and see the lights of Galata burning, normal, unthreatened, carrying on the business of survival while Constantinople burned, and feel what that meant. There was also a moment in the naval war that has been overshadowed by the land siege, but deserves to be remembered. In mid-April, a small convoy of supply ships, 3 Genoese vessels and 1 Byzantine ship carrying grain from Sicily, attempted to break through the Ottoman naval blockade at the entrance to the Bosphorus. Mehmed had over 100 ships defending the sea approaches. The 4 supply vessels were badly outnumbered. What happened next stunned everyone on both shores. The 4 ships fought their way through. The Genoese captains and their crews managed to outmaneuver, outfight, and outlast the Ottoman fleet for hours, using superior seamanship, better deck tactics, and the incendiary compound the Byzantines called Greek fire, until they reached the safety of the Golden Horn. Mehmed, watching from horseback on the shore, was reportedly so enraged that he rode his horse into the surf. It was one of the few unambiguous victories of the entire siege. But it would not be enough, because Mehmed had already thought of something no one had anticipated. Something that would make the chain irrelevant. Something that required no ships at all. He was going to move his fleet overland. The Genoese colony of Galata occupied the hill directly across the Golden Horn from Constantinople proper. It was technically neutral. Genoa had treaties with both the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Sultanate, and the Galatans had carefully positioned themselves to maintain commercial relationships with whoever won the coming conflict. They had refused to send formal military assistance to Constantinople, and they had formally pledged to remain outside the conflict. But Galata was porous. Genoese citizens who were in Constantinople when the siege began, merchants with warehouses there, men with Byzantine wives, sailors whose ships were in the harbour, many of them stayed and fought. Their colony's official neutrality meant nothing to individuals who had personal reasons to be on the walls. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the most important military commander on the Byzantine side, was a Genoese nobleman who had come with his own force of 700 professional soldiers. Funded by his own money, out of a personal sense of obligation or adventure, or both, the cannon damage was relentless. Every day the great barrel fired, sometimes several times, though the heat of successive firings risked cracking the metal, and Urban and his team were careful about the rate of fire. Each shot targeted the same section of wall repeatedly, not different sections. This was deliberate. Concentrated fire on one point, over days, would eventually bring down an entire section, where distributed fire would only chip and damage without bringing anything down. Every night, the defenders repaired what they could. They filled the gaps with earth and barrels and timber, materials that paradoxically were better at absorbing cannon impacts than stone, because they flexed rather than shattered. This was discovered through the bitter schooling of the first few days of bombardment. The crew of defenders became improvisational engineers, learning on the job what absorbed cannon fire and what didn't. The women of Constantinople brought supplies to the walls. This is documented in multiple contemporary sources, and is one of the most consistently overlooked aspects of the defense. The civilian logistics operation was substantially run by women. They carried water, food, replacement tools, rope, earth in bags, the timber frames that supported the emergency repairs. They moved between the city and the walls under Ottoman cannon fire. They were not fighters, but without them, the fighters could not have fought. On April 20th, something happened that gave the defenders their first and only moment of genuine hope. 3 Genoese galleys and 1 large Byzantine transport ship attempted to run the Ottoman naval blockade in the Sea of Marmara and reach Constantinople with supplies. The Ottoman fleet, which vastly outnumbered them, engaged them. What followed was a naval battle that lasted several hours and was watched from the walls of Constantinople by the defenders and by Mehmed himself from his position on the shore. The 4 Christian ships won. They fought their way through the Ottoman fleet, using their higher freeboard and superior seamanship, repelling Ottoman attempts to board, and reached the chain that protected the Golden Horn. The chain was lowered for them, and they entered the harbour. The city went wild. The defenders on the walls were screaming and weeping and throwing their helmets in the air. In the Fenar quarter, in the neighbourhoods behind the walls, people who had been living under the siege for weeks rushed into the streets. This was proof that the Ottoman navy could be beaten, that ships could reach them, that the West had not entirely abandoned them. It was also, as it turned out, the only such arrival. No more ships came. But for one night, Constantinople believed it might survive. On the night of April 21st, 1453, the people of the Fenar quarter were awakened by a sound they could not immediately identify. It was a groaning, rhythmic sound. Wood on wood, the creak of enormous weights in motion, the voices of hundreds of men calling to each other in Turkish. It came from the direction of the hills north of the city, from the direction of Galata. By morning, they understood. Mehmed had realized that as long as the great iron chain stretched across the entrance to the Golden Horn, his fleet could not enter the harbour to threaten Constantinople from the water. The chain was a tactical problem he could not solve by force. The Byzantine and allied ships inside the harbour had already proven they could defend it. So he went around it. In secret, over the course of several days, Mehmed's engineers had constructed a wooden roadway, a path of wooden planks laid on greased logs, from the Bosphorus shore, up over the hills behind Galata, and down to the upper reaches of the Golden Horn, above the point where the chain was anchored. Using teams of men and oxen, Working through the night, Mehmed moved 70 ships, fully rigged warships, over that road and down into the Golden Horn. 70 ships, over a mountain. This was not just a military achievement, it was a psychological devastation. The people of Constantinople had believed the harbour was safe. The Great Chain, a massive iron barrier stretching across the Golden Horn's entrance, supported by floating timber, had protected them from seaborne attack for as long as anyone could remember. It had turned back Arab fleets. It had held against the Crusaders. It was one of the fundamental certainties of life inside the walls. Now Mehmed had simply gone around it. The practical consequences were immediately severe. Constantinople now had to defend not just the land walls, but also its harbour shoreline, a section of wall far less formidable than the Theodosian triple ramparts. This stretched the already thin defending force even further. Men who had been fighting and repairing and fighting again for 3 weeks were now required to cover additional positions with no additional men to cover them. And the psychological effect was worse. Inside the city, the mood had been grim since the siege began, but sustained by a stubborn conviction that the walls would hold, that help would come, that the city's extraordinary history of survival would somehow continue. The appearance of Ottoman ships in the Golden Horn cracked that conviction for many people. Euphrosyne's neighbour, a fisherman named Kyriakos, who had lived next door for 20 years, came to her bakery that morning and said something she would remember for the rest of her life. If they could move ships over a mountain, he said, they can do anything. He was not wrong. What came next, in the following weeks, was a grinding war of attrition that the defenders were slowly, inevitably losing. The Ottomans now threatened the harbour walls. They attempted to build a bridge across the Golden Horn using barrels, a floating pontoon bridge, to move troops from the Galata side into the harbour and assault the waterfront walls. This was partially disrupted by the defenders, but it consumed time and energy from men who had no reserves of either. Urban's cannon kept firing. The Theodosian walls kept absorbing damage. The repair crews kept working at night. But the gaps were getting harder to fill, and the men doing the filling were getting more exhausted with each passing day. Mehmed tried several other approaches during this period. An attempt to tunnel under the walls, which was discovered and flooded by Byzantine counterminers. One of the few unambiguous tactical victories of the siege. A negotiated offer to Constantine. Mehmed sent word that if the emperor surrendered the city peacefully, he and all who wished to leave could depart freely with their property. Constantine refused. He could not surrender a city that was not, he felt, merely his to give. It belonged to its people, to its history, to God. Whether that was nobility, or stubbornness, or both, is a question historians have never quite resolved. Perhaps it was all three simultaneously. Perhaps in the end, those three things were the same thing. Inside the city, ordinary life continued in its attenuated siege-adapted form. Markets still operated in a reduced way. Churches still held services. Euphrosyne still baked her bread, though the flour supply was becoming inconsistent, and she had started mixing in ground barley to make it stretch. Her son Demetrios was posted to the wall section near the Caligaria Gate, not far from the Blackenay Palace. She could sometimes see the wall from the edge of the fanar, though not him specifically. She brought bread to the walls when she could. Other women did the same, Byzantine women, ordinary women, carrying food and water to the defenders, because the logistics of the defense were so inadequate that this unofficial supply network was genuinely essential. Women who had no role in the military defense of the city were nonetheless sustaining it, jar by jar and loaf by loaf. This is almost never mentioned in the histories of the siege. By the middle of May, Mehmed began to grow impatient. He had been told the siege would last 2 weeks. It had lasted 6. His army was restless. His officers were beginning to mutter. And so the young sultan set a date. There would be one final, massive assault, and if it failed, he would lift the siege. The date was May 29th, 3 days away, and within Constantinople, in the way that impossible secrets always travel through besieged cities, people began to know. Mehmed's response to the defeat of his fleet was not rage, or not primarily rage. It was engineering. He had lost a naval engagement. He needed his fleet in the Golden Horn. The chain across the entrance was impregnable. Therefore, he would move the fleet into the Golden Horn by a different route. The hill of Galata sits between the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn. From the harbour on the Bosphorus side of Galata to the Golden Horn on the other side is a distance of roughly half a mile over the hill itself, through the back streets and terraced hillsides of the Genoese colony. The height to be crossed at the summit is perhaps 200 feet. Mehmed ordered a road built over the hill, greased with animal fat, planked with timber, equipped with capstans and windlasses at the critical grade changes. His engineers had somewhere between 2 weeks and 10 days to prepare it. And then, beginning on April 22nd, his crews moved 70 galleys and smaller vessels overland through the Genoese colony of Galata, whose leaders could only watch in horrified silence, their neutrality now utterly academic, and down into the Golden Horn. The Venetians in the harbour, their fleet anchored inside the Golden Horn, behind the chain, had intelligence that this was being planned. They attempted a night attack on the transport route with fire ships before the overland passage was complete. The operation failed. An Ottoman informant, possibly a Greek or possibly from the Genoese colony itself, warned Mehmed's forces in time for the fire ships to be intercepted. The Venetians lost men. The transport operation continued. This incident, the betrayal of the fireship operation, was one of several moments in the siege where the behaviour of the different parties within the besieged coalition became a factor. The Venetians blamed the Genoese for informing on them. The Genoese insisted they had nothing to do with it. The truth is uncertain. What is certain is that a besieged city, beginning to suspect its own allies of betrayal, is a city in serious psychological trouble. The strategic consequence was severe, but not immediately catastrophic. The Ottoman fleet in the Golden Horn could now threaten the sea walls, the shorter, lighter walls along the harbour, forcing Constantine to divide his already inadequate garrison between the land walls and the sea walls. Men he could not spare from the Theodosian land walls had to be detached to cover the harbour. But the psychological consequence was worse than the strategic one. The ship overland operation was the moment the defenders realized that Mehmed was not constrained by conventional military logic. He had moved ships over a hill. What else might he do that no one expected? The fixed points of reference, what was possible, what was impossible, had been destabilized. And in the city behind the walls, where the civilian population had been living under bombardment and siege for weeks, the news that the Ottoman fleet was now in the Golden Horn spread with the specific horror of information that confirms what people had been trying not to believe. The walls of Constantinople had held against every siege for 1,000 years. The enemy was not supposed to be in the Golden Horn. The world was not supposed to work this way. Euphrosyne, in her bakery in the Fenar, would have been able to see the Ottoman ships from the windows that faced the water. She would have watched them going about their business in the harbour that had always been safe. And she would have continued to bake bread, because what else do you do? May 28th, 1453, the day before the end of Byzantine Constantinople. The last full day of a civilization that had existed in unbroken continuity for 1,100 years. Constantine XI spent the morning making his dispositions. He reviewed his defensive positions one final time. He knew the numbers. He had always known the numbers. What he was doing now was not strategic calculation, but something closer to a commander's valediction. Going to each section of the wall, speaking with the men there, not giving orders so much as bearing witness to their sacrifice. He wept openly, according to the Venetian Niccolo Barbaro, who recorded events in a diary that remains one of the most important primary sources of the siege. He wept and he apologized to his Greek subjects, to the foreign volunteers, to the Venetians and Genoese who had come to die for a city not their own, for the fact that he could not protect them. The Emperor of the Romans, apologizing to his soldiers. It was one of the most human moments in a siege full of inhuman pressure. Late in the afternoon, word went out through the city. There would be a great procession. The Hodegetria icon, the most sacred image in Constantinople, the icon said to have been painted by St. Luke himself, and to show the Virgin Mary pointing toward the Christ child, would be carried through the streets of the city. It was the icon that had protected Constantinople through siege after siege, the palladium of the city, the object around which its spiritual identity most closely gathered. The procession assembled at the church of the Chora and wound through the streets. Thousands of people joined it, men and women from every neighborhood, from every age. Monks and merchants and soldiers still in their armor, old women who had prayed before the icon since childhood, children who didn't fully understand what was happening, but understood that their mothers were weeping. Euphrosyne walked in the procession with a candle, as did most of the women of the Fana. She said later, in the few references that survive of her words, that the icon seemed to her more radiant than she had ever seen it before. This was almost certainly a function of the candlelight and her own heightened emotion. But it is what she believed. And what she believed in that moment is part of the story. What happened next was one of those moments that even secular historians record with a kind of awe. The icon fell. It was an accident. The bearers stumbled. Perhaps the street was wet. Perhaps exhaustion made someone's hands uncertain. But in a culture steeped in the language of omens, in a city where the sacred and the mundane were inseparably woven, it meant only one thing. And then it began to rain. Not gently, violently, a sudden unseasonable storm that drenched the procession and extinguished candles and turned the streets to mud. Lightning struck. The procession broke up in confusion. The icon was recovered and carried to shelter. People stood in the rain, soaked and terrified, trying to understand what they were seeing. That night, the city was covered by an extraordinary atmospheric phenomenon that the chronicles describe as a column of fire, or a strange glow surrounding the dome of Hagia Sophia. Modern historians have proposed various explanations. Moonlight refracted through rain clouds, bioluminescence, a reflection of the Ottoman campfires. Whatever its cause, it was seen by people on both sides of the walls and was interpreted universally as a supernatural portent. For the Christians inside, it seemed to confirm the worst. What happened next was one of the most extraordinary liturgical events in the history of Christianity. Constantine XI called everyone to Hagia Sophia. For the past several decades, the theological rift between the Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, which had been formally separated since 1054, had been a live and bitter issue inside Constantinople. An attempt at union, the Council of Florence in 1439, had produced a formula of reunion that most Greek clergy and laypeople bitterly opposed. The issue had torn the city apart. Cardinals who came from Rome were sometimes attacked in the street. The patriarch who signed the union documents was forced to flee. On the night of May 28th, none of that mattered. Constantine XI knelt in Hagia Sophia beside Catholic cardinals and Venetian merchants and Genoese soldiers. Greek Orthodox bishops served alongside Latin priests. The liturgy was conducted in both Greek and Latin, in the church where it had never before been possible to do both. Every distinction and every grievance dissolved in the understanding of what was coming with the dawn. This was the last Christian service ever held in Hagia Sophia as a church. After the service, Constantine met privately with his closest companions, Greek and Venetian and Genoese, all together. He asked their forgiveness for any offense he had given. They asked his. The Venetian Barbaro, who was there, recorded that there was not a dry eye in the room. Then Constantine armed himself and rode to the walls. He was the last emperor of the Romans. He died as what he was, on the walls, fighting. No one knows exactly where he fell. His body was never definitively identified. He simply disappeared into the chaos of the final assault, his purple imperial boots perhaps recognized by soldiers who reported having seen him fall. He did not escape. He did not surrender. He did not leave. There is something in that, though what exactly it is, whether nobility or tragedy or both, depends entirely on how you look at the world he was defending. Meanwhile, in the Fana quarter, Euphrosyne returned from Hagia Sophia to her house and baked through the night. She loaded the baskets. There was a curfew now, a prohibition on civilians approaching the fighting positions. She couldn't go to the walls, but she had to do something. So she baked. At 1:30 in the morning of May 29th, the Ottoman drums began. The sound was unlike anything the defenders had ever heard. Thousands of drums, all beating together, and behind the drums, the great assault forming out of the dark. The last night of Byzantium was ending. What came next would not be something anyone on those walls had the language to describe. The liturgy in Hagia Sophia, on the night of May 28th, was something that had been unthinkable for years. The Byzantine Church had been bitterly divided over the Union of Florence, the agreement signed in 1439, by which the Byzantine Emperor had accepted papal supremacy in exchange for promised military assistance from the West. Orthodox clergy who opposed the union had refused to celebrate liturgy with those who had signed it. The division had run through monasteries and parishes and families for 14 years. But the catastrophe had an ecumenical quality. When the end is coming, the fine points of ecclesiastical controversy have a way of receding. On that last night, Catholic and Orthodox clergy celebrated the Divine Liturgy together in the greatest church in the Orthodox world. The union that had been a political arrangement, deeply resented, became for a few hours a genuine shared act of worship by people who knew they were about to die. Constantine XI made his farewells that night. After the liturgy, he moved through the city on horseback. He was a man in his late 40s, Greek by heritage, but shaped by the particular Byzantine culture of the Peloponnese, where he had ruled before taking the throne. He was not a brilliant man in the way that some emperors had been, not a theologian or a philosopher or a great administrator. He was a soldier, and a conscientious one, and a man who understood what his title meant. The title meant you stayed. When a Venetian captain had offered him a place on a ship, he could escape. The empire could be reconstituted in exile. His survival was more valuable to future Greek resistance than his death on the walls. Constantine had refused. The accounts of his refusal are consistent across multiple sources, some of them hostile to him. He said, or words to this effect, "They would certainly say that for the sake of preserving my life, I abandoned my city and the flock entrusted to me by God." He was not willing to be that emperor. He was willing to be the other kind. He made private apologies. Multiple sources, including a Greek account written by a man who was there, record that Constantine, in his final hours, asked forgiveness from the people he governed. Not a formal liturgical act, but something personal. An acknowledgement that his reign had not preserved what he had inherited, that the catastrophe was arriving on his watch, that he was sorry. This is an extraordinary thing for a medieval emperor to do. The political theology of Byzantine emperorship was not constructed around personal apology. The emperor was God's representative on earth. Humility before God was expected, but personal apology to subjects was not part of the template. That Constantine did it anyway, that he seems to have felt genuinely responsible, genuinely sorry, tells us something about the man. He was the last emperor of Rome. He knew it. And he spent his last night not making plans for his personal survival, but riding through his city and saying sorry to the people he had not been able to save. Whether Euphrosyne was among those who came out to see him pass, we do not know. Her bakery was in the Fanar quarter, some distance from the route he would have taken. But she would have known he was making his rounds. That kind of information moves fast in a neighborhood. She would have known, and she would have heard the sounds of the city responding to it, and she would have turned back to her ovens. Chapter 6. The Final Assault. Mehmed had planned his final assault with meticulous care. It would come in 3 waves, each designed to exhaust the defenders before the decisive blow. The first wave consisted of the irregular troops, the Bashibazouks, undisciplined fighters drawn from across the Ottoman world who were given permission to attack without pay in exchange for whatever they could plunder. They were brave and they were numerous, but they were badly equipped and poorly coordinated. Mehmed sent them first because he wanted the defenders exhausted before his better troops arrived. For 2 hours, the Bashibazouks threw themselves at the walls. The defenders, who had been watching and preparing all night, held. Giustiniani directed the defense at the Mesotachion with his characteristic combination of tactical intelligence and physical courage. The Venetian soldiers held their section. The Greeks held theirs. Arrows and crossbow bolts fell like rain on the attackers. The Bashibazouks withdrew with heavy losses. But the defenders were tired. 2 hours of intense fighting in the dark, after weeks of siege and a sleepless night of procession and liturgy. The second wave was the Anatolian troops, regular Ottoman soldiers, better equipped and better motivated than the irregulars. They hit the walls with more coordination and more destructive power. Scaling ladders appeared. The fighting on the battlements became hand-to-hand in some sections. They held, barely, but Giustiniani was wounded. The exact nature of the wound is disputed in the sources. Niccolo Barbaro says it was a crossbow bolt through the hand. Other accounts describe a gunshot wound, which is entirely possible given the quantities of firearms in use on both sides. What is not disputed is what Giustiniani did next. He stopped fighting. He asked for the key to the inner gate. Constantine V, who was nearby and witnessed this, reportedly begged him to stay to hold his position, that his men needed to see him standing. Giustiniani's response was not that of a coward. He had demonstrated extraordinary courage for 2 months, but of a man in genuine pain who may have been in shock, who had reached the absolute end of what any human body can endure. He went through the gate, and when his Genoese troops saw their commander leave the battlements, something broke. The Genoese section of the defence began to unravel. Some of Giustiniani's men followed him through the gate. Others stayed, but the cohesion that had held the critical section of the wall was fractured. And into that fracture, at the worst possible moment, came the Janissaries. The Janissaries were Mehmed's elite troops, the finest infantry in the world at that time. They had been held back through the first 2 waves, resting while the irregular troops and the Anatolians exhausted the defenders. They were fresh. They were disciplined. They had been training their entire lives for exactly this moment. They hit the damaged section of the Mesotachion and began to climb. The defenders fought them at the tops of the scaling ladders, brutal, personal, exhausting combat, sword and axe and spear at arm's length. For a time, it held. But then came the Kirkoporta. The Kirkoporta was a small postern gate in the wall near the Blachernay Palace, a private entrance used historically by the emperors to come and go from the palace to the area outside the walls. During the siege, it had been used occasionally for small sorties, and on the night of the final assault, someone forgot to lock it. The Ottoman soldiers who found the Kirkoporta open poured through. They were inside the walls before the defenders on the nearby battlements understood what was happening. From above, the defenders suddenly saw enemy soldiers, not attacking the walls, but already inside, behind them. Someone raised the cry that would end everything. The Turks are in the city. In a defense this thin, this exhausted, this psychologically fragile, that cry was the end. The defenders on the walls above the breach, hearing that the walls had been penetrated elsewhere, began to look over their shoulders. The Janissaries, seeing confusion among those above them, redoubled their attack. Within minutes, the Mesotachion section broke. The Ottoman army flooded through. Constantine V, realizing what was happening, tore off his imperial insignia. He did not want to be taken alive and displayed as a trophy, and charged directly into the fighting. This is attested by multiple witnesses, though none of them actually saw him fall. He simply disappeared into the battle. The last emperor of the Romans fighting on foot died in the breach of the city his family had ruled for 1100 years. In the Fana, Euphrosyne heard the bells. She was still in her bakery. The alarm bells had a sound she had known her entire life, the signal for fire, for earthquake, for the ordinary catastrophes of urban life. But these bells rang differently. Multiple churches, all at once. The pattern that meant not fire or flood, but invasion. She stopped what she was doing. She looked at the baskets of bread she had been preparing. She looked at the door, and then she began to do what mothers do. She began to run toward the walls, toward the place where her son was. The Ottoman army was inside Constantinople. The walls had fallen, but the city had not yet surrendered. And for the thousands of ordinary people still inside, the ones who had nowhere to go, nowhere to run, and 7 ships in the harbour they would never reach, the worst was just beginning. The Bashibazouks who formed the first wave were not the Sultan's best troops. They were irregular fighters, volunteers and mercenaries from across the Ottoman domains, motivated by the prospect of plunder rather than professional pride. Mehmed deployed them first quite deliberately, to exhaust the defenders, to use up arrows and ammunition and physical energy, and to probe the defences for weakness. He could afford casualties in the first wave. The Bashibazouks could not be replaced, but they could be replaced by the men who came after them. The defenders held the first wave. This was expected. The Bashibazouks were not equipped or organised to take a wall defended by professionals. But the cost was real. Arrows were used, the emergency repairs to the walls were further damaged by the pressure of the assault, and the men on the walls had been fighting for 2 hours when the call came for the second wave. The Anatolian regulars, better equipped, better organised than the first wave, professional Ottoman soldiers rather than irregulars, came next. Their assault was coordinated rather than spontaneous, and it targeted the sections of wall most damaged by the previous weeks of cannon fire. The fighting for these sections was severe. The defenders held again, but more narrowly. The key figure was Giustiniani. He moved along the wall during the attack, reinforcing the critical points, directing the defence with the instinct of a soldier who had done this kind of work before. The Byzantine defenders, who had less experience, followed his lead. The Genoese professional in the middle of the defence was the organising principle that kept it coherent. Then Giustiniani was wounded. The nature of the wound is disputed in the sources. Some say a crossbow bolt through a gap in his armour. Some say a gunshot wound. Small firearms existed by 1453 and were in use. Some say an arrow. What is consistent across sources is the anatomical location. The wound was serious, and it was below the arm, penetrating through the side of his armour. It was not immediately fatal, but it was incapacitating, and the combination of blood loss and pain made it impossible for him to continue on the wall. He asked for his men to carry him to the ships. Constantine XI, by some accounts, tried to convince him to stay. The sight of the commander of the professional force being carried from the wall would, and did, have an immediate and severe effect on the defenders' morale. But the wound was real, and Giustiniani was dying, and the men who carried him were not wrong to do so. The accounts of this moment are consistent in noting one detail. As Giustiniani was carried past a section of defenders, some of those defenders, seeing their commander leaving, understanding what this meant, left the wall too. Not all of them, but some, and those who left gaps. In medieval wall defence, a gap in the defenders is as dangerous as a gap in the wall. The men who stayed fought on. But the coherence of the defence had broken at its centre. And at the Kirkeporta, the small postern gate in the Blackernay section, used for supply movements during the siege, someone had left the gate unlocked. No one knows who. No contemporary source names a specific responsible party, and the later accounts that blame various individuals are contradictory and probably retrospective scapegoating. The gate was unlocked. Ottoman soldiers found it and poured through. The breach was not at the cannon-damaged section of wall, but in a place no one had expected. The wall, which had not been broken, was bypassed. Islamic military law, in the Ottoman tradition, a law that Mehmed had formally invoked before the assault, allowed his troops 3 days of pillage in a city taken by storm. This was not a breakdown of order. It was the order. The 3 days were a contractual obligation to his soldiers, a payment in kind for the blood and risk of the assault. The agreement was explicit and formal. Whatever they could seize in those 3 days was theirs. The first hours were the worst. The soldiers who entered through the breach at the Kirkeporta and the Mesotakion spread through the city before any kind of order could be established. In those first chaotic hours, before the formal organisation of the pillage, there was killing. Soldiers who had just fought their way through a wall were in no state to be selective, and anyone encountered with a weapon, or anyone who appeared to resist, was cut down. But the killing subsided faster than it might have, because Mehmed had been explicit about what was valuable and what was not. Dead people were not valuable. Living people were. The market for slaves, a fundamental economic institution of the medieval Mediterranean world, Christian and Muslim alike, was enormous, and a living person was worth far more than a dead one. This is a disturbing calculation to articulate, but it had real survival implications. The instinct of the Ottoman soldiers, once the initial violence of the breach passed, was to capture rather than kill. The city's civilian population was, in the brutal economics of the age, a resource. Thousands of people made the same decision in those first hours. They ran to Hagia Sophia. This was not merely a practical decision, it was also a spiritual one, grounded in a prophecy that had been circulating in Constantinople for as long as anyone could remember. The prophecy said that if enemies ever entered the city and reached Hagia Sophia, an angel would descend from heaven and arm the defenders, driving the invaders back. The sacred space of the great church was, in the popular understanding, inviolable. By mid-morning, there were thousands of people inside Hagia Sophia. The doors had been locked from the inside. The congregation had barricaded the entrance and was praying. And then the doors came down. The Ottoman soldiers who entered Hagia Sophia did not find the angel. They found people. Thousands of people who were immediately separated by age, gender, and apparent status. The young and the strong, and the visibly wealthy, were taken for the slave markets. The old were mostly released. They were worth little, and there was no point keeping them. Children were taken. Children were especially valuable. The ropes used to bind the captives ran out quickly. The soldiers improvised, using the richly embroidered altar cloths, the gold-threaded liturgical vestments, the silk hangings of one of the most magnificent churches in the world, as rope. The ornaments of 1,000 years of Christian devotion were turned into restraints. This is specifically documented by witnesses. It is one of the images that haunts the fall of Constantinople in the Greek historical consciousness. The cloths of Hagia Sophia used to bind the Hagia Sophia's own congregation. Euphrosyne did not go to Hagia Sophia. She had been moving toward the walls when the assault came through, and when the reality of what was happening became clear. Soldiers in the streets, people running, the bells going silent one by one as each church was reached. She retreated to a neighbor's house in a side street off the main Fanar road. She spent the first hours under a trapdoor in the floor, beneath a pile of grain sacks, with 2 other women from the neighborhood and a child who had been separated from her parents. She never found her son Demetrios in those first hours. We'll come back to this. The pillage lasted 3 days. The sources differ on the details of its intensity and character. The Greek accounts emphasize the violence and the horror. Some Ottoman accounts portray a more organized and controlled process. The truth was probably somewhere between these extremes, varying by neighborhood and by the character of individual commanders. What is agreed is that the material wealth of Constantinople, the art, the gold, the jewels, the relics, the books, the plate, the silks, was comprehensively removed in those 3 days. A city that had been accumulating treasure for 1,100 years was stripped in 72 hours. The libraries were a particular disaster. Private libraries, monastery libraries, the collections of scholars and churchmen, all were ransacked. Books were used as fuel, torn apart for the binding leather, thrown into the streets. Some were taken by soldiers who understood they had value, without knowing precisely what that value was. Most were destroyed. Niccolo Barbaro, who survived and escaped, recorded that within hours of the walls falling, a price emerged for human beings in the improvised slave markets that sprang up throughout the city. He recorded specific numbers. It is sickening to read. It was the reality of a world in which people were commodities, and Constantinople's population had just been converted into one. By the end of the first day, the city that had called itself the center of the world was beginning to understand that whatever it had been, it would not be that anymore. But not everyone was taken. Not everyone was killed or enslaved or robbed. Some people escaped. And how they escaped, the narrow paths and hidden boats and desperate disguises, is one of the most human stories of the entire catastrophe. Because the last ferry was still, technically, in the harbour. The 3-day sack of Constantinople was not an accident or a breakdown of order. It was a contractual obligation. Mehmed II had promised his army 3 days of plunder as a condition of their service. This was standard practice in medieval warfare. Soldiers who undertook the enormous risk and hardship of a major siege expected to profit from it if they succeeded. The promise of plunder was recruitment, it was motivation, it was the economic model of pre-modern warfare. Mehmed could not have assembled and held together his army without it. And having promised it, he was bound to deliver. The 3 days were calculated to begin at dawn on May 29th and run through dawn on June 1st. What happened inside that window was, From the Sultan's perspective, authorized. Property destruction, looting, the killing of those who resisted being taken. These were within the rules. Gratuitous massacre was not officially sanctioned, but the line between authorized plunder and massacre is not easily maintained when tens of thousands of soldiers are moving through a civilian population. The people who had sheltered in Hagia Sophia numbered in the thousands. They had locked the great bronze doors and barricaded them from inside, and for several hours the soldiers outside could hear them praying and could not get in. Then the doors were forced. The soldiers moved through the interior, and what happened next is described by multiple eyewitnesses in terms that are consistent in their outline, even if they disagree on details. The people were separated. The young and strong were bound for sale as slaves. The old and the very young were of less commercial value. The clergy were targeted for their vestments and for any portable gold or silver on their persons. The great altar of Hagia Sophia, gold encrusted with gems representing centuries of imperial donation, was stripped. The silver fixtures were pulled from the walls. The liturgical objects were taken. The gold mosaic panels on the walls were too large and too fixed to be easily removed. They stayed, watching, while the building was transformed around them. The slave columns began moving out of the city within hours of the conquest. Contemporary Ottoman sources record the numbers with a commercial precision that is more disturbing than any emotional account could be. Tens of thousands of people were processed. The young men were worth more than the old ones. The women with certain characteristics were worth more than others. The clergy were worth something specifically for ransom. Children were worth a great deal, young enough to be taken entirely out of their culture, to be given new names raised in different households. Niccolo Barbaro, on his ship in the harbour preparing to leave, watched the slave columns from the water. He recorded what he saw with the detached precision of a ship's surgeon, accustomed to noting things clinically. The columns stretched as far as he could see. He did not estimate a number. He simply recorded that they stretched as far as he could see. The libraries were also targeted, though less systematically than the churches and houses. Books had value, parchment manuscripts especially, since parchment was expensive to produce. Some were taken for their commercial value as objects. Some were taken by soldiers who could read Greek, or who knew that literate people in their world might pay for ancient texts. Most were simply destroyed, used as fuel, trampled underfoot, discarded in the street where the pages blew through the ruined city in the wind coming off the Bosphorus. In the Fanar quarter, the process was somewhat different than in the neighbourhoods closer to the land walls. The Fanar, as a predominantly Greek civilian neighbourhood rather than a military zone, was occupied more gradually. The soldiers who moved through it were mostly looking for slaves and portable wealth rather than fighting military resistance. The experience was catastrophic, but differently so than the frontal assault on the walls. How Euphrosyne survived those 3 days, we do not know. Whether she hid, whether she was taken and ransomed, whether her presence in the bakery gave her a temporary economic protection. A woman who could make bread was not without value to an occupying army. We cannot say. We only know that she survived, because the story requires it. And the story requires it because some people did survive, even in the Fanar, even in those 3 days. 7 ships. As the walls fell and the Ottoman army poured through the streets, 7 ships, Venetian and Genoese, the remnant of the small Allied fleet that had been stationed in the Golden Horn, began a desperate race to escape. The captains, Venetian and Genoese merchantmen who had chosen to stay and fight, now had a single objective: get through the harbour entrance and into open water before the Ottoman fleet could close off the exit. The Great Chain had already been partially compromised, and with the city falling, the mechanism that controlled it was in Ottoman hands, or abandoned. The 7 ships made it through. They carried somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 people, a figure that sounds large until you set it against the 50,000 still inside the city. The ships were packed beyond their safe capacity. People had to be turned away. This is the moment the title of our story is about: the last ferry. The ships that existed, that were accessible to some, that sailed with some and without others. The arbitrary, terrible mechanics of who reached the harbour in time and who did not, who made it onto those ships. Primarily, people who were already near the waterfront when the walls fell. Venetian and Genoese merchants whose houses were in the harbour districts, soldiers and sailors who had been stationed near the ships, a few Byzantine officials who had made their way to the harbour during the night, and people who had simply been in the right place at the wrong time, who happened to be near the waterfront when the breach happened, who ran toward the water instead of toward the walls or toward Hagia Sophia. The Venetian ships that made it out eventually reached Venice and Crete and other Venetian possessions, carrying news of the fall of Constantinople to a Western world that received it with shock. The letter from the Pope's own representative described it as a catastrophe equal to a second death of Homer, meaning the death not just of people, but of learning, of culture, of the accumulated knowledge that Constantinople had preserved. But there were other escape stories, less organized, more desperate. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev was one of the most important ecclesiastical figures at the siege, a Greek who had converted to Catholicism and represented the Pope's cause for the church union. He was in Hagia Sophia during the final liturgy. When the walls fell, he understood immediately what his fate would be if captured. As a prominent advocate for the hated church union, he would be worth nothing to his captors and potentially dangerous. He had to disappear. He stripped off his cardinal's robes and exchanged clothes with a dead beggar found in the street. He then lay down among the dead and injured. And when Ottoman soldiers moved through the area, they passed him by. One more body in a street full of them. He eventually made his way to a Genoese ship and escaped to the island of Chios. Others survived through similar improvisations. There was a network of Greek families who had connections with the Genoese colony at Galata across the harbour, connections built through years of cross-harbour trade, who managed to cross the water to Galata in small boats in the chaos of the first hours. Not because Galata was perfectly safe, but because it gave them time. The Ottoman occupation of Galata was more organized and restrained than the chaos inside Constantinople. And there were those who survived simply by hiding and staying hidden. The Greek community in Constantinople had centuries of experience with occupying forces, going back to the Crusader occupation of 1224. The city's physical geography was complex enough, its streets narrow and winding enough, its buildings layered enough, that someone who knew where to go could stay out of sight. A number of people, the exact figure is unknowable, survived by going into the oldest and most complex parts of the city. The abandoned neighborhoods, the ruined palaces, the churches no one had used for decades, places where Ottoman soldiers were unlikely to look because there was nothing obviously valuable there. The great cisterns of Constantinople deserve particular mention. The city had been built on extensive underground water storage, enormous Byzantine cisterns, some of them cathedral-sized spaces supported by hundreds of columns, holding the water reserves that allowed the city to survive long sieges. The Basilica cistern, still visible in Istanbul today, is the most famous. There were hundreds of others. Some of these cisterns provided hiding places in the first days. Their entrances, known to the Greek population, were unfamiliar to the Ottoman soldiers. People who knew where the cistern access points were could disappear underground. It was not comfortable. It was dark and wet and cold and terrifying. But it was alive. Not everyone who hid survived. Some were found, some starved, some were given away. There are accounts, uncomfortable to read, of Greeks in the city who, hoping to curry favour with the new masters, pointed out where people were hiding. This happened. It is part of the story. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople was not a simple story of conquerors and conquered. It was complicated by every human motivation: self-preservation, betrayal, unexpected kindness, principled resistance, and the ordinary compromises that people make when the world has ended and they are trying to figure out how to exist in whatever comes next. Among those who did not escape and who were not hiding, there was one man whose fate has fascinated historians for centuries. He was the most powerful Greek official in the city. He had the resources, the connections, and the physical location to have gotten onto one of the departing ships. He chose not to. and what happened to him tells you everything about the impossible position of the Greek elite at the moment of Constantinople's fall. The 7 ships that escaped did so in the window between the fall of the walls and the complete closure of the harbour. The Golden Horn chain was still in place. The Ottoman fleet was inside it, but the chain controlled the exit into the Sea of Marmara. In the chaos of the first hours of the conquest, there was a period when the chain could still be navigated, when the attention of the Ottoman naval forces was elsewhere, when a ship with a skilled captain and a willing crew could make the run. 3 of the ships were Venetian, belonging to the private merchant fleet that had been trapped in Constantinople when the siege began. 1 was Genoese. Some of the others were of mixed provenance. The commander of the Venetian squadron, Gabriele Trevisano, had taken an oath before the battle to fight to the last for the city. He honoured the oath until the walls fell and the situation became militarily hopeless. And then he made the decision that every practical naval commander had to make. You cannot defend a fallen city from a ship. On the ships was a remarkable cross-section of Byzantine society's upper tier. Merchants with their account books, clergymen with their reliquaries, scholars with manuscripts they had grabbed, officials with documents they could not bring themselves to abandon. These were the people with connections to Venetian and Genoese merchant networks, the people who had the personal relationships and the social capital to get a place on a departing vessel. The ordinary people of the Fanar had neither. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, the papal legate who had been sent to Constantinople to oversee the implementation of the Union of Florence, was not on the ships. He was in the city when it fell, and he survived by one of the most remarkable pieces of social improvisation in the historical record. He found a recently killed man, dressed the body in his own cardinal's robes, and presented it to the Ottoman soldiers as himself. While the body in cardinal's vestments was dragged away as evidence that a notable prisoner had been captured, Isidore changed into the clothes of a common labourer and walked out of the city in a slave column. At some point in the column's march, he escaped, reached the coast, and eventually found passage to Rome. Less discussed in the conventional histories is the number of Greeks who survived by actively cooperating with the Ottoman conquest, providing information about hidden valuables, naming neighbours who had concealed wealth, helping identify individuals of high ransom value. This is not comfortable history. It is consistent with every other experience of military occupation in every era. People under overwhelming external pressure make choices that prioritize survival over solidarity, and the moral framework that governs normal life collapses under the weight of immediate terror. The informers were a small minority, but they existed, and their existence is important to note, not as an indictment of the Greeks who were in an impossible situation, but because it is part of the full picture of what happens when a city falls. The conquest of Constantinople was not a story of undivided heroic resistance. It was a story of human beings under extreme pressure, behaving in all the ways that human beings behave under extreme pressure, with courage, with cowardice, with resourcefulness, with betrayal, with astonishing acts of mutual aid, and with the everyday survival calculations that look different in the historical record than they felt in the moment. The ones who hid in the underground cisterns of Constantinople and Constantinople had enormous underground cisterns. Some of them, cathedral-sized, were trying to wait out the 3 days of authorized sack. Some succeeded. The cisterns were known to the city's residents, but less familiar to the occupying forces. People hid in the water, in the dark, breathing the damp air, listening to the sounds of the occupation above them and counting the hours. What did they think about in those hours? What does a person think about when their city has fallen and they are hiding in the dark under it? We cannot know. We can only note that some of them survived. That the darkness gave back what it was trusted with. His full title was Megastu, Grand Duke, and his name was Lucas Notarus. He was the most powerful non-imperial figure in the Byzantine state. He commanded the Byzantine navy, such as it was. He controlled enormous wealth. His family had been accumulating property and commercial assets for generations, maintaining connections with Genoa, Venice, and the Ottoman court simultaneously. He was, in the language of the late Byzantine Empire, a survivor, a man who had navigated the collapsing world around him with extraordinary skill. Notaras is famous for a phrase. Whether he actually said it is disputed, but it has attached to him permanently. Better the Sultan's turban than the cardinal's hat. The context was the bitter debate inside Constantinople about the church union with Rome. The union, which would have subordinated the Greek Orthodox Church to the authority of the Roman Pope, was the price that the West demanded in exchange for military help. Most Greek clergy and intellectuals despised it as a betrayal of their faith. Notaras was one of its most vocal opponents. His phrase, "better Turkish rule than Roman religious authority," was not unusual in Byzantine political discourse. Many of his contemporaries felt the same. They believed that under Ottoman rule, their faith could survive. Under Roman ecclesiastical dominance, it would be transformed beyond recognition. This was, in the event, a calculation that proved partly correct. But Notaras also had a purely practical calculation. His position made him one of the most valuable potential intermediaries between the Greek population and the new Ottoman rulers. His wealth, his connections, his knowledge of the city's administration, all of this made him potentially useful to Mehmed in a way that an ordinary Greek citizen was not. He had reason to believe that he would survive the fall of the city as a privileged intermediary. He chose to stay. He chose not to get onto the last Venetian ships. He hid his family and his wealth and waited for what came next. For the first few days, his calculation appeared correct. When Mehmed entered Constantinople on May 29th, riding through the Carizzian Gate on a white horse, making the symbolic entry that this moment required, he did not simply begin executing the leadership of the defeated city. He was more sophisticated than that. He understood that ruling Constantinople required people who knew how it worked. Mehmed reportedly sought out Notaras almost immediately. He needed someone to help organize the Greek population, to establish communication between the Sultan and the community he now governed. Notaras was the obvious choice. For several days, Notaras appears to have functioned in this intermediary role. He helped organize the Greek community. He provided information about the city's administration. He cooperated, and then something happened that no practical calculation had anticipated. Mehmed wanted Notaras's son. The young man, variously described as adolescent or young adult, remarkably handsome according to the sources, was intended for Mehmed's court in a way that Notaras understood immediately and found intolerable. What Notaras said and did in response depends on which source you read. The Greek chronicles say he refused absolutely, prepared his son and himself for death, and was beheaded along with his son and son-in-law on the same day. Some sources say the three of them were executed together, that they embraced before their deaths, that the younger Notaras asked to die first so that his father would not have to watch. Ottoman sources are more circumspect. The picture from those accounts is murkier. There may have been multiple reasons for Mehmed's decision, including political calculations that had nothing to do with what the Greek sources record. Whatever the precise circumstances, Notaras and his sons were killed. The man who had calculated his survival, who had chosen to stay and cooperate, who had made himself useful to the new power, he was gone within weeks of the city's fall. This is one of those historical moments that resists easy moral interpretation. It is possible to argue that Notaras made a pragmatic choice that was nearly correct, foiled only by an unpredictable personal element. It is equally possible to argue that there was never a safe calculation to be made, that the illusion of control in the face of absolute power is always an illusion. And it is equally possible to argue that his refusal, in the end, was the one moment in his life where calculation and something else, call it dignity, call it love for his son, ran together in the same direction. Notaras is not a hero in this story. He is something more complicated, a man trying to survive in impossible circumstances, whose survival instincts served him very well until the moment they didn't. He is human in his complexity, in a way that the cleaner moral categories of heroism and villainy cannot capture. His wife and daughters survived. Some family members eventually made their way to Italy. His granddaughter, the great-granddaughter of the Megasdu of Constantinople, would end her days in Venice. The families of the powerful found ways to survive even when the powerful themselves did not. This too is part of the story. But among all the things that were lost and all of the things that were taken when Constantinople fell, there was one category that almost no one talks about, a loss so vast and so consequential that it changed the intellectual history of the entire Western world. And the most remarkable thing about this loss is that some of it, unexpectedly, became the engine of a rebirth. Lucas Notaras was the highest-ranking Greek official to survive the fall of Constantinople. His title, Megasdu, Grand Duke, made him the commander of the Byzantine navy and one of the 3 or 4 most powerful men in the empire. He had been a major figure in the internal politics of the city during the siege, and those politics had been complicated. Notaras was the man most associated with the phrase that had become a rallying cry for the anti-union party. Better the Sultan's turban in the city than the Cardinal's mitre. Whether he actually said this is disputed. The phrase appears in sources written after the fall and may have been retrospectively attributed to him. But it captures a real position that he held. He preferred Ottoman rule to submission to Rome, and he had acted on that preference by opposing the Union, and, in the eyes of some contemporaries, by being insufficiently vigorous in preparing the city's defence. Notaras's survival calculation during the siege, insofar as we can reconstruct it, appears to have been based on the assumption that he would be useful to whoever won. He had been careful not to commit himself fully to either side in the ecclesiastical politics of the Union question, maintaining relationships that crossed the divide. He had negotiated with Ottoman officials before. He had, possibly, made some arrangement or hoped to make one that would allow him to function as an intermediary between the new Ottoman administration and the Greek population. This was not unreasonable. It was, in fact, the role that Gennadios Scholarios would eventually play. The Ottomans did need Greek intermediaries. A man of Notaras's rank and connections could have been enormously valuable in the transition. He knew where things were, who people were, how the city had worked. He could have been the first Phanariot. But something went wrong. The accounts of Notaras's execution differ in detail, but agree in outline. He had survived the conquest, been identified as a notable prisoner, and was being held. Then Mehmed sent a message that Notaras's son, a beautiful young man, in the phrasing of several sources, was to be sent to the Sultan's palace. The subtext of this demand, in a 15th century Ottoman context, was unmistakable. Notaras refused. He refused, and he was taken to Mehmed. And Mehmed, who had perhaps expected to be refused, who may have wanted a reason to remove a potentially troublesome figure of high Byzantine status, had him executed. Along with his son and his son-in-law, the entire male line of the Notaras family, eliminated in a day. Was the demand a test? Was it a pretext? Was it genuine desire that became rage when refused? The Ottoman sources are not illuminating on this point, and the Greek sources have their own interests. What we can say is that the episode tells us something important about the nature of survival. In the aftermath of conquest, being potentially useful was not sufficient protection. Being predictably useful required a form of submission that Notaras, in the end, was not willing to provide. His wife survived. She was ransomed. She had family connections in Venice who had the means, and eventually died in Italy. She outlived her husband and both her sons, and had to carry the knowledge of how each of them had ended. The story of Lucas Notaras is often told as a cautionary tale about the anti-union position. Look what happened to the man who preferred the Sultan's turban. But this framing is too simple. He died not because of his theological position, but because he refused to sacrifice his son. That is a different kind of choice. That is the choice of a father. In the summer of 1453, a ship arrived in Venice carrying a Greek scholar named Demetrios Chalkokondyles. He had with him a trunk of manuscripts. He was one of dozens. In the weeks and months after the fall, Greek scholars arrived in Italian cities carrying whatever they had been able to save from the libraries and collections of Constantinople. Some had planned ahead. they had sent manuscripts to safety in previous years. Sensing what was coming, others had grabbed what they could carry in the chaos of the final hours. What they brought with them was extraordinary. Constantinople had been the greatest repository of ancient Greek texts in the world. While Western Europe had lost most of its classical knowledge during the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the works of Plato, Aristotle's full corpus, the Greek dramatists, the historians, the scientists, the mathematicians, Byzantium had kept them. Byzantine scholars had been copying and preserving Greek texts for 1,000 years. In the burning and looting of Constantinople's libraries, an unknown but certainly enormous quantity of these manuscripts was destroyed, but not all of them. Cardinal Bessarion, who had left Constantinople years before and was in Rome when the city fell, had already been systematically collecting Greek manuscripts for decades, anticipating exactly this catastrophe. His collection, bequeathed to Venice, became the foundation of the Bibliotheca Marciana, the great library of Venice that still exists today. He had effectively been running a rescue operation for Byzantine intellectual heritage for 20 years before it was needed. The manuscripts that arrived in Italy after 1453, from Bessarion's prior efforts and the desperate refugee scholars, entered an Italian intellectual world that was already primed to receive them. The Renaissance was already underway in 15th century Italy. Humanist scholars were rediscovering the classical world, developing new approaches to art and literature and philosophy. But their access to Greek texts had been limited. They had mostly been working from Latin translations of translations, often filtered through Arabic intermediaries. The arrival of the Greek refugees changed this. Suddenly, Italian scholars had access to original Greek texts, not translations, but the actual Platonic dialogues in Greek, the original Aristotle, the complete works of the Greek dramatists. And they had teachers. Greek scholars who could read these texts in their original language, who had spent their lives with them, who could explain what was ambiguous or difficult. The Greek scholars who fled Constantinople became teachers, translators, editors. They worked in the printing houses that were beginning to spread across Italy. Aldus Manutius in Venice employed Greek scholars to prepare accurate editions of the Greek classics for the new printing press. The first printed editions of Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Sophocles, Aeschylus, Thucydides, virtually all the Greek classics, were prepared by refugee scholars from Constantinople and their students. The fall of Constantinople and the Renaissance are not merely coincidental events. The connection is direct, documented, and profound. This is one of the great historical paradoxes. The catastrophe that ended one civilization catalyzed the rebirth of another. The destruction of Byzantine Constantinople helped produce the Renaissance, which led eventually to the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the modern world. None of which consoles the people who are enslaved in Hagia Sophia. But it matters historically in ways that are still with us today. But there is a parallel story in the books that were not saved. We don't know what was lost because it was lost. This is the epistemological problem of cultural destruction. The holes in the record are invisible. We know, from ancient catalogues and references in surviving texts, that there were works by classical authors that existed in Constantinople and don't exist anywhere now. We know that Byzantine scholars were writing original works in the 15th century that largely don't survive. We know that the libraries of the great monasteries contain texts whose content can only be guessed at. What was in the books that Ottoman soldiers used as fuel in the first days? What was in the collections that were sold by the bundle to merchants who didn't know what they were buying? What was in the personal libraries of the scholars who couldn't carry everything and had to leave most of it behind? We don't know. We can't know. That is what irreplaceable means. Among the Byzantine scholars who fled was a man named John Argyropoulos, who became one of the most influential teachers in Florence, instructing Lorenzo de' Medici and a generation of Italian humanists in Greek philosophy. His students included some of the defining figures of the High Renaissance. His contribution to Western civilization came directly from Constantinople's catastrophe. There is something deeply uncomfortable in this accounting, the way that Byzantine suffering produced Western flourishing. It is not a comfortable narrative. It does not resolve into a story with a moral. It simply is what happened. A catastrophe that was catastrophic for the people inside it, and transformative for the civilization that absorbed its refugees. But let's return to the city itself, because within a few weeks of the conquest, something happened that almost no one expected. Mehmed II, the man who had burned and looted and enslaved, made a decision about what Constantinople would become next. And that decision would shape the lives of the Greeks who stayed, and their descendants, for the next 4 centuries. The connection between the fall of Constantinople and the Italian Renaissance is one of those historical relationships that seems too neat to be entirely true, and yet is supported by the evidence at every step. The Renaissance was already underway before 1453. Humanist scholars in Florence and other Italian cities had been recovering and studying classical texts for a century before the fall. Petrarch, often called the first Renaissance humanist, died in 1374. The rediscovery of the ancient world was not caused by the refugees from Constantinople, but it was enormously accelerated by them. The difference between having classical texts in Latin translation, often through Arabic intermediaries, often incomplete, often altered in transmission, and having the original Greek texts, taught by scholars who had grown up reading them as living literature rather than ancient artifacts, is difficult to overstate. The Greek refugees from Constantinople were not merely couriers delivering packages. They were teachers who transformed how Italian scholars understood what they were receiving. George of Trebizond, Theodore Gaza, Demetrios Chalkokondyles, these names are not well known outside of specialist scholarship, but the men they name were among the most influential teachers of the 15th century. Their students at Italian courts and universities included some of the defining figures of the High Renaissance. The Greek scholars who arrived from Constantinople after 1453 were not refugees depending on Italian charity. They were possessors of knowledge that Italian scholars desperately wanted and were willing to pay for. The Italian attitude toward the Greek refugees was complex sympathy, mixed with a slightly proprietorial excitement about the texts they carried. The refugees were welcomed not simply as people who had survived a tragedy, but as bearers of something the Italians considered a heritage they were also entitled to: the legacy of ancient Greece, which the Renaissance cast as the source of the civilization they were attempting to revive. The Greek scholars were, in this framing, guardians of a patrimony that properly belonged to all inheritors of the classical tradition. The Greeks, for their part, were learning to live as perpetual scholars in exile. The community of Greek intellectuals in Italy after 1453 maintained a vigorous internal culture. They corresponded with each other. They argued about theological and philosophical questions. They maintained the tradition of Byzantine scholarship in a diaspora context. They were not simply absorbed into Italian culture. They persisted as a distinctive community with their own institutions and their own sense of what they were preserving and for whom. What was lost despite the refugees and their manuscripts is beyond calculation, which is exactly what makes it so disturbing. We know from Byzantine book catalogues, from references in surviving texts, from the testimony of scholars who were there, that the libraries of Constantinople contained works that are nowhere in the modern world. Plays by Sophocles and Euripides that are not in any existing manuscript. Histories by ancient authors we know only by name. Scientific treatises, mathematical works, the complete correspondence of figures whose influence we can trace, but whose actual words we cannot read. These are not hypothetical losses. They are documented absences, things that were there in 1450 and are not anywhere now. The scholars who survived and reached Italy knew they had not saved everything. They knew what they had been forced to leave behind. They knew what had been burning while they were carrying what they could carry. This knowledge, the knowledge of the specific irreplaceable thing that was lost, lived with the refugee scholars until they died. It is one of the most human aspects of cultural catastrophe. Not just the loss itself, but the knowledge of it, carried by the people who saw it happen, bequeathed to their students as a kind of wound. On the afternoon of May 29th, 1453, a young man on a white horse rode through the broken gates of Constantinople. He was 21 years old. He had spent 7 years planning this moment. He had built the cannon that broke the walls, assembled the army that took the city, managed the politics that kept the Western powers from intervening in force. He had done what no one in the Muslim world had managed to do for 800 years. and his first act upon entering the city was to dismount. Mehmed II stepped down from his horse and took a handful of earth. He poured it over his head. It was an act of deliberate piety, a Muslim gesture of humility before God, a public acknowledgement that this victory belonged not to him, but to the faith. But it was also something else. It was a signal to everyone watching, including his own generals, that what came next would be conducted according to his will, not the momentum of conquest. He was not a warlord exulting. He was a sultan taking possession. He rode to Hagia Sophia. The great church still stood. The massive bronze doors had been broken, and several thousand of the people who had sheltered inside were now in the process of being sorted. Some already bound as slaves, others still crowded in the nave, terrified, uncertain. The building itself was intact. The mosaics still watched from the walls. The dome still rose above everything. Mehmed ordered a halt to whatever was happening inside. He entered. Contemporary accounts, including those of his own court historians, describe him as standing in the nave of Hagia Sophia and weeping. Whether this is true or symbolic, it entered the record. A Greek historian who later served at the Ottoman court wrote that the Sultan surveyed the ruined columns and broken marble, and murmured a couplet from the Persian poet Sa'di. The translation from Persian goes roughly: "The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. The owl calls the watchers in the towers of Afrasiab." It is a verse about the impermanence of greatness, about how empires end, about how the spaces where power once lived become the habitations of silence. He had just conquered an empire, and his first articulated thought was about how empires end. Mehmed II ordered that Hagia Sophia be converted into a mosque. This was expected. It was the logical act of conquest, the dominant religious space of the conquered civilization being repurposed by the conquering one. The conversion was carried out quickly. The altar was removed, the bells were stripped, the mosaics, those extraordinary Byzantine images of Christ, the Virgin, the emperors, were covered with plaster or wooden screens. A mihrab was installed, indicating the direction of Mecca. A minaret was added. The building that had been a church for nearly 1,000 years became a mosque. The first Friday prayers were held within the week. But here is the thing that is rarely noted. Mehmed also ordered the building repaired and preserved. He did not tear it down. He did not let it continue to be damaged. The Hagia Sophia that became a mosque was also the Hagia Sophia that survived. The conversion and the preservation were the same act. And then Mehmed II did something that almost no conqueror in history has done after a 3-day sack. He tried to put the city back together, not for the sake of the people he had just conquered, but because he had a larger ambition, and for that ambition, he needed a city. He needed a functioning, populated cosmopolitan capital of an empire, and that meant he needed the Greeks. What Mehmed understood, and this distinguishes him from most conquerors, was that an empty city is worthless. Constantinople's value was not in its ruins, but in its position, the crossroads of Europe and Asia, the Bosphorus gateway, the commercial heart of the Eastern Mediterranean. A depopulated city sitting on that geography was a monument to waste. He needed people, so he got people. The Ottoman policy of Zurgun, forced resettlement, was deployed on a massive scale. Communities from across the Ottoman domains were ordered to relocate to Constantinople. Turks from Anatolia, Jews from across the Balkans, Armenians, Genoese merchants from Galata, who were allowed to stay as a protected community, Greeks from the surrounding territories. It was not an invitation. It was a command. Families who had lived in their towns and villages for generations were given notice and told to move to the ruins of Constantinople and rebuild. The great cosmopolitan city that emerged over the following decades was built on this compulsion, a diversity that was engineered, not organic. But it worked. Within 20 years, Constantinople was a functioning city again. Within 50, it was one of the great cities of the world. Mehmed did something else that was unexpected. He reconstituted the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate. The Patriarchate had been in a complicated state in the years before 1453. The Union of Florence, the agreement by which the Byzantine Church had nominally submitted to Rome in exchange for Western military aid, had split the Greek Church bitterly. The patriarch who had signed the union was reviled by much of his flock. Mehmed had no interest in having his Greek subjects under the spiritual authority of the Pope. He wanted a Greek church that was autonomous from Rome, an institution that would serve as an administrative layer for his Greek subjects, responsible for their internal affairs, their family law, their community governance. He found the perfect candidate in Gennadios Scholarios. Scholarios was a theologian and scholar who had been one of the most vocal opponents of the Union of Florence. He had refused to attend the liturgy in Hagia Sophia on December 12, 1452, when union with Rome had been formally proclaimed. He had been in Constantinople during the siege, but had survived and was enslaved. Mehmed had him found, ransomed from his owner, and brought to the palace. He offered Scholarios the position of ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. The anti-union Greek scholar became the patriarch of Constantinople under the authority of the Sultan who had just destroyed Constantinople. The irony is extraordinary. Scholarios had been so committed to Orthodox independence from Rome that he had preferred the prospect of Ottoman conquest to submission to the Pope. And now he was running the Greek Orthodox Church under Ottoman protection. The relationship between the Patriarchate and the Sultanate would last for nearly 5 centuries. Under Ottoman rule, the Patriarch had authority over not just spiritual matters, but civil affairs for the Greek Orthodox community: marriage, inheritance, education, internal disputes. The Greeks who lived under Ottoman rule had their own legal and social framework, maintained by the Church, recognized by the state. This arrangement was called the millet system. Each religious community, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Jewish, operated as a semi-autonomous administrative unit under Ottoman governance, with its own leadership, its own law, its own institutions. It was not equality, it was hierarchy, the Ottoman Muslim community at the top, the others beneath. Non-Muslims paid the jizya, the poll tax. They could not bear arms, could not build new religious buildings without permission, faced various civil restrictions. But they could live. They could practice their faith. They could maintain their language and their culture and their community. The Patriarchate remained in the Fanar quarter, the neighborhood where Euphrosyne had baked her bread, the neighborhood that had been home to Greek Constantinople before the fall and would remain the center of Greek Constantinople after it. The Greeks who remained and rebuilt their lives in Ottoman Constantinople came to be called the Phanariots, after their neighborhood. Over the coming centuries, they would become some of the most influential people in the Ottoman Empire. Greek merchants controlled much of Ottoman maritime trade. Greek doctors served at the Ottoman court. Greek scholars ran the Ottoman translation offices, serving as intermediaries between the Sultan and the European powers who conducted their diplomacy in languages no Ottoman official read. The title of dragoman, chief interpreter for the Ottoman government, was held by Greeks almost continuously for 2 centuries. It was a position of extraordinary influence, carrying with it access to the Sultan's court, to diplomatic correspondence, to the inner workings of an empire. The Phanariots who had survived the fall by hiding insistence or pretending to be dead emerged into a world in which their community, damaged and diminished, had found an unexpected niche in the new order. Not equals, not free, but present, irreplaceable in their way, necessary. Mehmed II had not set out to save Greek civilization. He had set out to conquer Constantinople. But by restoring the Patriarchate, tolerating the Phanariot community, employing Greek scholars and merchants and administrators, he had, as a byproduct of practical governance, created the conditions under which something of Byzantine civilization could continue. Not what had been, but something, a thread. And in the Fanar quarter, in the weeks after the conquest, a Greek widow and her son found each other alive. They sat together in a room that was still standing, and they ate bread. He had been sent on an errand. In the final hours of May 28th, Demetrios Philaretos had been pulled from his position at the Calagaria gate section and sent across the city with a message. A small bureaucracy of desperation was still functioning in the imperial headquarters at the Blachinae Palace. Messages needed to go to Giustiniani's Genoese command, to the Venetian Bailo, to the defensive sections managing the land walls. Someone had to carry them. He was young. He was fast. He knew the streets. The message he carried was never delivered. By the time he reached his destination, the Kerkeporte had already been breached. The final assault was underway, and the city was falling. He hid. In a cellar beneath a merchant's house near the Theodosian Wall, he pulled rubble over himself and stayed very still for a very long time. He was alive by accident, by the randomness of being given an errand, by the luck of a cellar and rubble, and the noise of the assault moving past him in the dark. We do not know this. We are imagining it. But the logic of history requires that someone survived who should not have, and someone died who should not have, and the line between them was arbitrary. This is always true in disasters. The survivor carries that arbitrariness for the rest of their life. Euphrosyne was in her bakery. She had been there most of the night, as she had said she would be. The dough had been set, and the ovens had burned their last wood, and the bread had been baked as the city fell around her. Whether she did this out of faith, or habit, or sheer determination not to let the work of her hands become meaningless, we do not know. We only know what the bread represents: the insistence of ordinary life in the face of extraordinary catastrophe. The refusal to stop doing the thing that sustains people. When the sounds of the final assault reached her neighborhood, she had done what she could. She had locked the bakery door and sat in the back room and prayed and waited. The Ottoman soldiers who came through the Fenar quarter in the first hours of occupation found nothing in her bakery worth taking except food, and some of them did take the bread. She let them take it. She had already hidden what she needed. When Demetrios came through her door, she did not speak for a long time. She had not known. She had suspected. She had told herself, with the discipline of a woman who had survived losses before, that not knowing was better than knowing, and that the city had survived catastrophes before, and that Greek people had survived empires before. She had told herself these things, and she had baked bread. They ate the bread together, the bread she had baked through the last night of Byzantine Constantinople. This is a small thing. It is a very small thing in the context of the scale of what had just happened. The end of an empire that had lasted 1,000 years, the death of thousands, the enslavement of thousands more, the beginning of a new era in the history of Europe and the Middle East. Against all of that, one woman and one young man eating bread in a bakery in the Fenar quarter is negligible. But it is also the whole point. History is the stories of the people who made decisions and fought battles and built empires. But history is also this: ordinary people continuing, surviving, maintaining the thread of daily life through catastrophes that should, by any measure, have broken it. The bread that Euphrosyne baked was not a political act. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was bread. And it kept two people alive for another day. That is what survival looks like. Not triumph, just another day. But what happened to the Greek community of Constantinople after that morning? What did the next 500 years look like for the descendants of the people who had not been on those 7 ships? And what remains today in the city that was once Constantinople? The Phanariot Greeks under Ottoman rule did not simply survive. In some respects, by some measures, they flourished. The Ottoman Empire needed intermediaries. It was a vast, multi-ethnic, multilingual empire whose capital was full of Greek, Italian, Latin, and Persian speakers, whose trade routes ran through territories whose languages no single Ottoman official could master. The Greeks, who had been operating as commercial and diplomatic intermediaries in the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, were ideally positioned. Greek merchants dominated the Ottoman grain trade, the silk trade, the maritime commerce of the Aegean and Black Sea. Greek doctors studied at Italian universities and returned to serve at the Ottoman court. Greek interpreters, the dragomans, handled the empire's correspondence with Venice, France, England, and the Habsburg Empire. And the ecumenical patriarchate, established in the Fenar quarter by Mehmed II's order, became one of the most influential institutions in the Orthodox world. The Patriarch of Constantinople had authority over Greek Orthodox Christians, not just in the Ottoman Empire, but across Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, in what is now Romania, and Bulgaria, and Serbia. The head of a conquered church became in some ways more powerful than he had been before the conquest, simply because the Ottoman Empire was larger than Byzantium had been in its final decades. The Greeks were not equal. Let this be clear. The millet system that gave them religious autonomy also inscribed their subordinate status in law. They paid taxes that Muslims did not. Their testimony in court was worth less than that of a Muslim. They could not build new churches without permission. They could not ride horses. The restrictions varied across different periods and different sultans, sometimes more stringent, sometimes relaxed, but the fundamental hierarchy never changed. What they had was a measure of self-governance within that hierarchy. And for a community that had watched its empire collapse, that was something worth protecting. This arrangement held, in its basic structure, for 4 centuries. In 1821, the Greek War of Independence began. The Phanariots were caught in an impossible position. Most of the leadership of the independence movement had roots in the Phanar, had been educated by Phanariot institutions, had been influenced by Phanariot political thinking. But the Greek community in Constantinople was hostage to Ottoman power. When the revolution began, Patriarch Gregorios V issued a formal condemnation of the revolutionaries, a desperate attempt to protect his community. He was hanged anyway. At the gate of the Patriarchate on Easter Sunday, 1821, the Ottoman government's message to the Greek community was unambiguous. His body was thrown into the Bosphorus. It was recovered by Greek sailors and taken to Odessa. He was later canonized. His gate at the Patriarchate has been kept closed ever since, in mourning, and remains so today. The 19th and early 20th centuries brought new pressures. The Ottoman Empire was in slow collapse. And as it collapsed, its minorities became targets for the anxieties of a failing state. The Greek community of Constantinople, which had numbered in the hundreds of thousands in the mid-19th century, faced periodic persecution, forced labor battalions during the First World War, and the systematic erosion of its legal protections. The 1923 population exchange between Greece and Turkey, negotiated in the aftermath of the Greco-Turkish War, theoretically exempted the Greeks of Constantinople and the Muslims of Western Thrace from the general exchange. But the exemption proved fragile. In September 1955, organized mobs attacked Greek property across Istanbul in what became known as the Istanbul pogrom. More than 4,000 Greek homes were destroyed. Thousands of shops were looted. Dozens of Greek Orthodox churches were vandalized. The organized, state-facilitated nature of the violence was never seriously disputed. The Greek population of Istanbul, which had stood at around 100,000 in 1955, collapsed in the following years, as families who had survived 5 centuries of Ottoman rule and 2 world wars concluded that they could not survive this. They left, for Greece, for Germany, for Australia, for America. They left the homes their families had maintained since before the fall. Today, approximately 3,000 Greeks remain in Istanbul. 3,000 in a city of 15 million. The ecumenical patriarchate still stands in the Phanar Quarter. The Church of St. George, where the patriarchs have been enthroned since the 17th century, still holds its liturgies. The Patriarch of Constantinople, officially the ecumenical patriarch, with spiritual authority over millions of Orthodox Christians worldwide, lives and works in a neighborhood where the community he leads has been reduced to a few thousand souls. The Halki Seminary, the main theological school of the Patriarchate, on the island of Heybeliada in the Sea of Marmara, has been closed by the Turkish government since 1971. The Patriarchate has no institution in Turkey where it can train clergy. The priests who served the remaining Greek community were educated in Greece or America or elsewhere, and returned to serve a community that is still slowly diminishing. The continuity that Euphrosyne and Demetrios embodied, the ordinary persistence of Greek life in Constantinople, has not ended. It has simply been reduced, again and again, by politics and violence and the centuries-long arithmetic of departure, until what remains is a candle, where once there was a fire. But the candle is still lit. And in the Phanar Quarter, on a street not far from where a bakery once stood, the bells of the Patriarchate Church still ring on Sunday morning. And the bread is still made. And the Greek language is still spoken in the oldest Christian city in Europe. And the story is not finished. 7 ships got out. 7 ships carrying perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 people out of a city of 50,000. The rest stayed. Some by choice, some by inability to leave, some by the accident of being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. Some because they had nowhere to go. Some because they believed, until it was too late, that the walls would hold. Some because they were already in the chains that had been put on them in the first hours of the sack. We know about the 7 ships because the people on them survived and wrote things down. Niccolo Barbaro, the Venetian ship's surgeon who kept a diary of the siege, one of the most valuable primary sources we have, was on one of those ships. His diary survived. We have it. Euphrosyne left no diary. She left nothing we can read. She existed as thousands of people from this period existed, verifiably, necessarily, because the city required people to function, and she was one of them, but invisibly to the historical record. Her name, if she had a name like Euphrosyne, is a choice we are making. Her bread, which she baked, is a truth we are inferring. This is the fundamental problem of history from below. The people who lived it rarely wrote it down. The people who wrote it down were rarely the people who lived it. The eyewitness accounts we have from 1453 were written by educated men, clergy, merchants, officials, soldiers with literary pretensions. They record what they saw, and what they saw was filtered through their education, their perspective, their survival. Barbaro's diary is invaluable. It is also the perspective of a Venetian surgeon on one of the ships that got out. What Barbaro recorded, and what the other survivors recorded, was sufficient for historians to reconstruct the outline of what happened in May 1453 with considerable confidence. We know the sequence of the assault. We know the timing of the Giustiniani wound and his retreat. We know approximately when Constantine XI disappeared from the record. We know the contractual basis of the 3-day sack. What we don't know is what it was like to be Euphrosyne. What it was like to be a Greek woman in the Phanar quarter, 50 years old, with a sun on the walls. What the night of May 28th felt like from inside a bakery. What the bread tasted like in the morning when she wasn't sure whether she had anyone left to give it to. We construct this. We infer it from what we know about human beings and about the texture of that time and place. We imagine our way into it because that is what history requires when the documents run out. Not invention, but a disciplined and humble act of imagination, anchored in everything that is known. The bread existed. We know this because bakeries existed in Constantinople, because Greek bakers worked in the Phanar quarter, because bread was the staple food of the Byzantine diet, because the siege had not cut off food supplies within the city, because the kind of ordinary domestic persistence that keeps people going through catastrophes is documented across every culture that has ever gone through one. The bread is real. The woman who baked it is real in every sense that matters for understanding what happened. But here is the question that this whole story turns on. What exactly ended on May 29th, 1453? What was the thing that died? Because the answer is not as simple as Byzantium. Byzantium ended. But the people who called themselves Byzantines did not. The church did not, the language did not, the neighborhoods did not. Something ended. But what? What ended it was a self-understanding. The people of Byzantine Constantinople called themselves Romaioi, Romans. They were not Roman in any ethnic or linguistic sense that Julius Caesar would have recognized. But they were the heirs of Rome's Eastern continuation, the people who had maintained Roman law and Roman administration and Roman imperial legitimacy for 1,000 years after the Western Empire collapsed. They were the inheritors of an unbroken tradition of governance, faith, and identity that stretched back to Augustus Caesar and beyond. After 1453, no one called themselves Romaioi in that sense anymore. There was no empire, there was no emperor, there was no tradition of Roman continuity to be heir to. The Greek Orthodox Christians who remained in Constantinople called themselves Greeks, or Christians, or simply the people of the Phanar. The Romaioi identity, that particular way of being in the world that had persisted for a millennium, ceased to exist as a living thing. The Greek language survived, the Orthodox faith survived, the community survived, the patriarchate survived. But the sense of being the continuation of Rome, that story about themselves that the Byzantines had told for 1,000 years, ended. That is not a small thing to lose. Civilizations run on their stories about themselves. When the story ends, something real ends with it. Constantine XI Palaiologos was never found. His body was never recovered and identified. There were claims in subsequent years. Ottoman accounts mention finding a body identified as the emperor's by his purple shoes, and Mehmed supposedly had it honoured and buried. But the burial site, if it exists, is unknown. The last emperor of Rome disappeared at the walls of Constantinople and did not come back. Almost immediately, legends began. He had not died. He had been taken by an angel and turned to marble and placed in a cave beneath the Golden Gate. He was sleeping there. When the time was right, when Constantinople was Christian again, when the Romaei were restored, the angel would restore him to flesh, and he would walk out of the cave and reclaim the city. The legend persisted for centuries. It still circulates in some communities. It is a story about the refusal of finality, the insistence that this ending is not permanent, that the sleeping king will return. He will not return. The marble emperor will not wake. Constantinople will not become Byzantium again. The Romaei are gone. But the story of the marble emperor tells you something true about what the loss felt like to the people who lived through it. Some losses are so large that the mind refuses to accept their permanence. Some endings are so complete that they generate their own mythology of reversal. The Greeks who told the story of the marble emperor were not confused about what had happened. They knew what had happened, but they also needed it to be not final, and so they made a story in which it wasn't. In 1934, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, in the process of building a secular Turkish republic from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire, ordered the Hagia Sophia converted from a mosque into a museum. The plaster that had covered the Byzantine mosaics for nearly 5 centuries was carefully removed. The mosaics were still there. The great golden face of the Christ Pantocrator, the Virgin and Child, the emperors, the saints. Under 500 years of plaster, they had survived. They had survived the fall of the empire that commissioned them, and the conversion of their home into a mosque, and 5 centuries of Ottoman rule. They were still there, patient as stone, waiting. In 2020, the Turkish government of President Erdogan reconverted the Hagia Sophia from a museum to a mosque. The mosaics were covered again, this time with curtains and screens that can be removed for cleaning. They are still there, still under their cover, still patient. The Kora Church, the Carrier Mosque, contains perhaps the greatest surviving program of Byzantine mosaics in the world. Its 14th century mosaics were uncovered by Byzantine scholar Paul Underwood in the 20th century and became internationally recognized as masterworks. In 2020, this building was also reconverted to a mosque. Its mosaics too were covered. The mosaics of Constantinople, the ones that survived the fall, the conversion, the centuries, are still in Constantinople. Still under their covers. Still waiting. In the Fana quarter of Istanbul today, there is a neighborhood that has been Greek for as long as the city has been a city. It is smaller now than it was. The houses of families who have been gone since 1955 are often empty or converted. The shops that used to serve a larger community serve a smaller one. The ecumenical patriarchate is still there. The patriarch still lives and works in the modest complex on the hill. The Church of St. George still holds its liturgies in a Greek that is recognizably descended from the Greek that Euphrosyne would have spoken, the Greek of the liturgy that was sung in Hagia Sophia on the night of May 28, 1453. On certain nights, a light burns in the window of the patriarchate. It is not a dramatic light. It is not a signal or a symbol in any formal sense. It is simply a lamp in a window, the way a lamp burns in any inhabited place. But it is in the same neighborhood where a woman baked bread on the last night of Byzantine Constantinople. And it is in the same neighborhood where a young man came home alive from the walls. And it is in the same neighborhood where the Greeks of Constantinople established the institution that has been their center for 5.5 centuries. The light burns, the bread is made, the bells ring on Sunday morning, the language continues. May 29, 1453, was a Tuesday. It is still called Black Tuesday in the Greek Orthodox calendar. The Tuesday after Pentecost, The same day of the week is observed as a day of mourning in the Greek Church every year. In the Patriarchate Church of St. George, on the last Tuesday before Pentecost, a special service is held. The priests wear black vestments. The liturgy remembers the fall. It remembers the emperor who disappeared at the walls. It remembers the thousands who were enslaved. It remembers the library that burned. It does not forget. This is the final act of survival. To remember. To insist that what happened mattered, that the people inside it mattered, that the ordinary woman with her bread, and the ordinary young man on the wall, and the thousands who could not get to the 7 ships, that they happened, that they were real, that they deserve to be recalled. Euphrosyne left no diary. But she left a tradition of bread baking that her daughter continued, and her daughter's daughter, and down through the generations of the Fanar community, until the community scattered, and the thread became impossible to trace. She left no words, but she left the fact of having been there. That is enough. That is, in the end, all any of us can leave. The bread she baked is gone, but the city is still standing, and the light is still on,